Okay, we should be online now. This is the Atlas Project, Episode 7. I'm Greg Salmieri here in New York. We're discussing Part 1, Chapter 7, the exploited and the exploited and the exploiters. And here I'm bringing up Ben Bayer, who is in New Orleans. And Ben, do you want to tell people a little bit about what we're doing and how this works?
Well, I can give the boilerplate, I guess. I thought you were going to do a little bit more, but it's okay. So the Atlas Project is a weekly chapter-by-chapter reading group. If you're just joining us for the first time, the way it works is we post discussion questions round about every Thursday. We let the discussion go on on our Facebook group for a few days. We review the comments. Then we have this broadcast, and we broadcast it to the Atlas Shrugged page and also to the Ayn Rand page on Facebook. I didn't have any other matters of business. Greg, did you want to mention anything? I don't hear you right now.
No, I thought we could just go right into the plot stuff.
Okay. So we are, as Greg mentioned, talking about the chapter that's called The Exploiters and the Exploited. And a significant portion of this chapter concerns Dagny Taggart's basically working against the clock to finish this Rio Norte line that she needs to build to save her company and basically to save Colorado, because that's where Wyatt Oil is and many of the new industries of the country. She's not just working against the clock, she's also working against a kind of a whole set of obstacles thrown up by the mediocrity of many of the people that she's working with. Her best contractor had quit. Now she's dealing one who doesn't really know as much about what he's doing. Her own engineers aren't really up to snuff. Her vendors are incapable of innovating with Rearden metal. So amidst all these battles that she's fighting, she comes to Colorado to see the construction. She meets both Ellis Wyatt and Hank Rearden, who have come to the construction site to observe things. This gives her some encouragement. It gives her some hope that they're going to be able to finish on time, both because of the attitude they express and also because of some of the innovations they're able to contribute to the process. But once she returns to New York and sees all of the ways in which the city depends upon Colorado, she says, "God help this city if we don't finish." And that's underscored then, especially by the fact that there's suddenly all this opposition that goes up against Rearden metal, which is of course what she's constructing her tracks out of. She's invited to a debate about the question of whether or not Rearden metal is a product of greed. She refuses to do the debate. Meanwhile, Rearden is approached by the State Science Institute, which doesn't want Rearden metal going onto the market. He turns down their offer to purchase the metal, which is what they want to do apparently to get it off the market. And then Dagny has to deal with the fact that one of her vendors, Mr. Moen, doesn't want to make any more switches with Rearden metal. And eventually, both this National Council of Metal Industries issues a statement against the metal, and then the State Science Institute condemns it. The result is that Taggart stock crashes, her contractor Neely quits, unions cancel their work on the line. And to try to solve this problem, Dagny first tries to get the statement retracted by the State Science Institute. She fails, and so her circumvention of it is to start a new company, the John Galt line, so that Taggart Transcontinental doesn't have to deal with the negative publicity. This means she has to raise the money on her own. She asks Francisco for a loan. In desperation, he declines. Rearden gives her one. And then at the end of the chapter, we find, though, that Rearden has to face a new obstacle, the passage of the Equalization of Opportunity Bill. And we're going to talk about many of these different events as we proceed with the rest of the broadcast tonight. So, Greg, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, thanks. So we're going to discuss this in a few different sections. We're going to start off talking about the relationship between Rearden and Dagny, which we've been tracing, and some developments to that relationship in this chapter. Then we're going to talk about some rival philosophies that we see. We meet I put Ben up rather than myself. We have a few people in the chapter who have very different views of the world than does Dagny, and we're going to talk about some of their views. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things Rearden does that advance the plot and are relevant to the rival philosophies we've looked at, and then at Dagny's main actions in the chapter. And then we'll look at some of the things that happen over the course of the day where the Equalization of Opportunity Bill passes, including how Rearden deals with that really striking event. Okay, so that's our plan of action, and let's just jump right into it, talking about Rearden and Dagny meeting up in Colorado. So Dagny's in Colorado at the beginning of the chapter where she's working on what's still the Rio Norte line. And why is Rearden there? Why is Rearden in town?
Check out the bridge, to check out the progress of his medal.
Yeah, so part of it is he wants to see his medal. That's what Dagny's original thought that he's there is for. He also mentions he's in Colorado to look at a mining property that he's considering. Mentions that later. He says, I was in Colorado, I thought I'd check out the site, but it becomes apparent that he's come there to look at the site twice, once when he didn't run into Dagny and this time when he did. And she says, you wouldn't have come here twice unless you had some goal, and it turns out his goal is the bridge. So there's a bridge, there's a gorge, there's a bridge crossing, that's part of the old Rio Norte line. The bridge is in disrepair. Dagny had the idea to get a Rearden metal bridge to replace it, but nobody on her team could design one, and so she gave up on that and is just ordered some bracing for the existing bridge to kind of shore it up temporarily. And Rearden doesn't like that idea. He thinks, no, a whole new Rearden metal bridge should be designed, and so he comes and he's there to look into that and sell her on the idea, which of course she's quickly sold by. And Rearden's view is there are too many people yapping about Rearden metal rails being unsafe. Let me give them something really to be worried about, a Rearden metal bridge. And Dagny is, of course, really impressed by this design. After all, she's been looking and trying to find the right design. The people who she, on her staff, who she asked to design it, gave her badly adapted versions of old bridges as echoes of the Fountainhead. If you think about the protagonist of the Fountainhead is always concerned that people aren't taking advantage of new building materials and the new methods they make possible. Well, this we have again with Rearden metal. And Rearden does it, and he has this brilliant new design for a bridge. She's really impressed by it. He mentions that he had this idea long before he had Rearden metal. If you had a metal with certain properties, you can build these different sorts of things, and he set out to find such a metal. Okay, so that's why he's there. But what's the personal connection? What's their interaction like while he's there? Yeah, Mohammed.
Unlike the party, which took place, it was more free, casual. They sat, I think, I don't know, they sat just on a piece of metal.
Uh-huh.
They didn't give it much thought. Very comfortable with each other as opposed to last time.
Yeah, exactly. There's a kind of comfort and ease that they have with each other, which they've had in the past, right? But which was conspicuously absent at the party. And indeed, she says part of the ease is the realization, Dagny's thinking, that both of them don't feel this kind of ease with anyone else. Yeah, Carrie Ann.
And just an additional little thing to add to it, where Dagny's having a quasi-realization of her response to Hank Rearden on the top of 162 of the mass market edition. She's talking about maybe being employed and that he would probably enjoy bossing her around, and he said, yes, I would. Don't you mess with me. And the phrase here is, she was struck by what the words made her feel. It was not an emotion, but a physical sensation of pleasure, which she could not name or understand, and then it moves on quickly. So
Yeah.
she keeps having these little hints of flashes that she has some feelings for him, but she doesn't name them. She doesn't acknowledge to herself really, I think, what direction she's going in.
Yeah, it's very much like with Francisco at first with her, right? So they're having this kind of combative repartee where he says, if you ever leave the railroad business, let me know. And, oh, you'd think of hiring me? You'd enjoy having me to boss around. And, at some point, she says, yeah, well, don't quit the steel business, trying to kind of bait him and fight with him. And he says, don't try it. Don't try to win at any game where I set the terms. And that's what she's... this is a real man to be reckoned with, I guess, is her feeling. But she feels it as a physical sensation, right? She's turned on. And
then you start wondering exactly what kind of contest does he mean? Is it a business contest or something more personal?
yeah.
We find out later. Stay tuned.
But in either case, she doesn't explicitly acknowledge this. This is just, she feels it and she doesn't name it. Good. Later on, there's a lot of, they're standing a certain way, she's standing in front of him as they're looking at the gorge, and she can feel his chest behind her without touching her just by the effect of the wind and her concentration. She's so aware of him there as the back of her trench coat flaps against him. And this is a very, a lot of sexual energy with very little contact, right? And that's interesting the way it's narrated. It really builds up the tension. And then there's another aspect of this scene I want to talk about a little later, but one bit of it that I can mention already is he says at one point, looking at the rail, and she's seeing just him and the coil of blue-green rail behind him, right? We've done it. And she feels that that's like the reward she's wanted for all her work. Before Rearden got there, she was reflecting on everything that had gone into building this line, all the difficulties she had, everything she had to do, and we'll talk later about what those things are and what it is that she's been doing. But she's been very aware of kind of the difficulties, and Rearden says, we've done it, and she feels it's like her reward. We've done this. And somebody pointed out, I don't have the particular passage right in front of me, I don't know if one of you do, but go ahead, Robert, then read it.
We've done it, haven't we? He said. In payment for every effort, every sleepless night, every silent thrust against despair, this moment was all she wanted. Yes, we have.
Yeah, so this is really kind of profound language, and keep that page open, because she then notices something trivial about the work that needs to be done. I mean, something that's not of such a, we have to replace that crane or something. And it's narrated what her mindset is thinking about this little thing in the light of that experience. And Carrie Ann or Robert, do you want to read that? I see you both seem to be looking at it.
The great clarity
Yeah.
being beyond emotion after the reward of having felt everything one could feel.
Yeah, so this comment, right, it's her great reward for all of this. It's her payment for these sleepless nights. And in the aftermath of this comment, she's in the great clarity of being beyond emotion. Is that the phrase? After feeling everything she could feel. Someone online, I forget who, and Ben, tell me if you remember, but somebody online said it's like she's talking about after sex at that point. And, it is a surprising, or particularly after the way Rand describes sex, where it's so metaphysically grand. So this comment really means a lot to her. And particularly when we're reading next chapter, it's worth keeping in mind this idea that at this moment, she's thinking she's felt everything she has the capacity to feel. Okay, so in this moment, they're at ease with each other, like they're not at ease with anyone else. Rearden says, we've done it, haven't we? There's this tremendous intimacy between them. And she asks where he's going and comments on his new car. Oh, that's such a good job, that car, and so forth. Are you going to drive it back? Maybe she's angling that she wants to ride back with him. We don't know. He says, no, I flew here. I'm going to fly back on my own plane. And she says, oh, well, I need to get to New York really quickly. I drove down, but can I fly back with you? And he pauses and then says no in a way that sounds a bit abrupt to her, although maybe it's just, we get this same abruptness as at the party, maybe. This kind of pulling away. During this whole visit, Rearden hasn't mentioned the party. He acts as though it hasn't occurred. And now when she wants to fly back with him, he says, no, I'm flying to Minnesota, not to New York. And yet, when Dagny goes to the airport to try to get another plane, she learns that Rearden's just flown off headed to New York. So Rearden lied about it, or seems to have lied. And thoughts on what the reason for that might be? Yeah, well,
When I read it this time, it occurred to me that by avoiding being alone with her, he is doing what the Vice President of the United States is currently being derided and vilified for.
yeah, I think that's right. So I guess the Vice President, there's been some articles about Mike Pence that he won't be in the same room with a woman alone because he's worried he'll get accused of sexual harassment, or maybe it's that he's worried that it's unpious of him to be,
Or he wants to avoid temptation.
or he wants to avoid temptation.
More specifically, he wouldn't have dinner. Lunch might be okay.
Oh, he wouldn't have
Yeah,
dinner
he
with a
Wouldn't
woman.
have dinner.
So, anyway, yeah, he doesn't. It seems like he doesn't want to be alone with Dagny, and I think that, given especially what we learn later in the chapter of his own reflections, which we'll turn to in a moment, or we'll turn to right now, actually, that seems very plausible.
And Greg, by the way, the person who noticed the other scene that you were talking about, the looking at the crane in a candid way, seems like it was the post-coital moment. That was Pooja. who noticed
Pooja.
that.
So yeah, good call, Pooja. Yeah, he's a little afraid of her and himself, says Ellen online. He's afraid of not holding his distance, says Harry. Corey says he doesn't want to have temptations. This is the same idea of resisting temptation. Pooja says, me, I'm the one who said that. So thanks for standing up for yourself and reminding me. Good. So let's talk. There are a few more things I want to talk about Dagny and Rearden, and then we'll move on to the issue of rival philosophies. So flash forward to Dagny now in Rearden's office. This is after she's now created the John Galt line. And she's giving him the first official order as the president of the John Galt line. It's the order for the steel to build this bridge that Rearden's designed. And Rearden says, so wait, you're going to be staying on the you're going to be staying at the site? She says, yes, I'll be sleeping in a railroad car. And he seems concerned about her. And she says, why, Hank, it's the first time you've ever thought I wasn't a man. And this is now the first time we get Hank's inner monologue on Dagny. We always see their interactions from her perspective up until now, and he just goes kind of cold at certain moments. Occasionally we get the narrator's perspective that tells us where he's looking when she doesn't notice him looking there. But now we get his thoughts. And does anyone have this page about? It looks like we've got... Yeah, you want to read us his thoughts, Robert?
Well, haven't I? Okay, so, haven't I thought of it since the first time I saw you? Haven't I thought of nothing else for 2 years? He sat motionless looking at her. He heard the words he had never allowed himself to form, the words that he had felt, known, yet had not faced, had hoped to destroy by never letting them be said within his own mind. Now it was as sudden and shocking as if he were saying it to her. Since the first time I saw you, nothing but your body, that mouth of yours, and the way your eyes look at me. If, through every sentence I ever said to you, through every conference that you thought so safe, through the importance of all the issues we discussed, you trusted me, didn't you, to recognize your greatness?
Yeah. And he goes... Yeah, this is page 204 in the book, in the standard edition. Robert, what is it in the mass market? Since you have it open, 196 in the mass market. So a few things. He has always seen her as a woman. He's now for the first time naming it to himself, and it's shocking to him. We've seen there's an unadmitted motive that drew him to Lillian's bedroom that he fought against admitting. And that now, and that made it impossible for him to be with Lillian. Now he's saying this has always been what it was to him being with her. It was always he saw her as a woman, and it's not like, and he's happy about that, right? There's something cold and hard and disturbing to him about that. You trusted me to recognize your value. You trusted me to think of you like a man, but I didn't, right? That mouth of yours, I wanted to knock it back, and it's very physical. I want to grab you and do things to you, right? What would it be like? And there's another interesting thing he says at the end of this passage, right, about
I want you, and may I be damned for it.
may I be damned for it, may I be damned for wanting you. And he sees this, recall, Rearden has come to believe the idea that this is a base desire. Muhammad, do you have the passage I had in mind?
Yeah. Let me just find it. Yeah, he says, he describes as bringing her down, to bring you down to things you can't conceive. Like, she has no idea.
Yeah, she's a pure woman,
right?
right?
And to know that it is I who have done it. To reduce you to a body, teach you animals pleasure, and things he doesn't think. Well, she's like, oh dear, what is this? Like, she doesn't know what.
Right.
Yeah.
He's got this kind of Madonna whore complex going on. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that this is the first time we get internal monologue from him about this. I mean, the way that he describes it now, he's wanted her from the first time he saw her. And we've gotten his internal monologue about any number of topics, about his thoughts about his wife, about sex generally. But this is the first time he's actually naming this fact to himself, which
Definitely, yeah.
makes you think that he's been repressing it up until very recently. And that
We know
might
that, I
not
mean,
be all
he's-
that he's... Yeah.
It's not just that he hasn't named it. He fought against acknowledging the motive that drove him to his wife's bedroom. And now we're told why, right? He thought that if he never named this, if he never admitted it to himself, if he pushed it down, it would go away. And he thought it should go away. Why? If we look a little bit further in his internal narration in this scene, why it's important that it go away. What's so horrible about this? This is a response that he thinks is awful, is wrong.
An animal-like.
It's degrading and animal-like, and why is it particularly awful that it should come to him from Dagny?
Because she's someone he sees as good, pure.
Yeah, this is the best person he knows, and he's having this vile, disgusting, animal-like response that he can't control in himself from her. And indeed, he says she's the only person he ever wanted. Like, and that's consistent with what we know about him. He's had this urge to have sex, but it's never been focused on a particular person before. He satisfied it once or twice with girls he thought he liked, right? And then he married Lillian because she fit the picture, but he's never had a specific, strong sexual attraction to a particular person. Now he has it to Dagny, this awful, gross physical urge with respect to her, the very best person he knows, and that shows something horrible about him. Ben talked about maybe he's a moral monster last time in his thinking, what some philosophers now call a moral monster, because he doesn't want to do what he thinks is right. This is way worse than that. He wants more than anything to do what he knows is wrong with the one person who's way too good for that kind of use, right? So this is really, really disturbing to him. Al.
Do you think that at this point in the novel, we know that Ayn Rand thinks that Rearden is wrong in this belief?
Well, if we do, then you shouldn't say it because it's a spoiler. But I think we do. The fact, we know Dagny would think he's wrong in this belief, right? And Francisco would think he's wrong in this belief. And the author is at least acknowledging that, and they're portrayed as positive characters. So I think we should at least have a strong suspicion that the author is not on the side of this belief of Rearden's. But it would be interesting, Iris, you talked about having read this for the first time in the 50s and how surprising and striking the sex scenes were at that time, and that's when a period where Rearden's attitude would have been seen as more appropriate by many than it is today. Do you have a sense of how readers received this at that time? When you read it the first time, was it clear to you where the author stood at this point?
I can't really remember what I was expecting to happen in the rest of the story.
So for other people who read it nearer to its time of origin. That's true. Oh, wait, we haven't talked about what? Oh, what's the...
Oh, I mean, it depends on which one we're talking about. Never mind.
Okay, I meant this very scene here, not there are future scenes that are controversial as well. Okay, so one other issue about Dagny and Rearden that I want to talk about before we move on, and that is there's something different about their attitudes towards not each other, but towards Colorado that comes across when they're both together in Colorado at the beginning. So Rearden says, does anyone recall how Rearden says being in Colorado makes him feel, seeing all the industry there?
10 years younger.
10 years younger, says Robert. Yeah, Colorado makes him feel younger. But that's not how it makes Dagny feel. It makes Dagny notice or remember that traffic is slowing down on all other parts of the line, right? So it makes Dagny cognizant that Colorado is the only place that's vibrant and vital like this, and it makes her worry about what's happening to the country. She says, this is what I thought it would be like, when I was told about the stories about the sun dying, everything stopping and getting colder. So Dagny's anxious about Colorado in a way that Rearden has an unalloyed happiness about it and enthusiasm. Dagny's anxious about it at this point, and she feels it very much on her shoulders that she has to save Colorado. And Rearden, and Dagny agree that, well, they never believed the sun would really run out. Human beings would find another source of energy, and there it is, says Rearden, pointing to the smokestacks. And Dagny says, that's what I thought too, but unless they can stop it. And Rearden says, do you really think it can be stopped? And she says, no. So what we're seeing in this dynamic is Rearden is confident. Rearden is pro-action. He thinks things are going to go well. He's so impressed by people's ability to produce and create his own, and those of people he admires like Dagny and Wyatt and so forth, that he thinks this will carry the day and none of the other stuff matters. Whereas Dagny is concerned. She's worried that it can be stopped, and she loses that worry somewhat in Rearden's presence, where we have that confidence. And we saw this pattern before, right? We saw this pattern before in the wake of the passage of the Anti-Dog-Eat-Dog Act, where Rearden's attitude was, it's bad, but it's temporary, it'll pass, we'll build the line, and Dagny says, but we had an impossible schedule to finish it in 12 months. Can we do it in 9? Can you get us a rail? Yeah, I can do it. And don't worry about it. You're going to be able to do it. And then Conway and everything else will all be back. It's all good. We'll be able to solve it because we have this ability to act. But Dagny, she believes that when she's with Rearden, and she believes it part-time. But there's also a real worry she has about Colorado. And this is the meaning, I think, and some people asked about it online, is the meaning of the scenes where when she's back in New York and she sees all these good things she regards as good, an oil truck, a really clever way of making toast, and all these different machinery and equipment that buoys her spirit, she notices it comes from Colorado. The brand, Wyatt Oil, Colorado, Hammond Cars, Colorado, Marsh, something, that Mark Electric, Colorado, Stockton Foundry, Colorado, and it makes her feel overwhelmed, anxious. We'll talk later about exactly what the emotion is, but this is because she has this worry or this tentativeness about Colorado, and that's my answer. Pooja, you were noticing this and speculating about it online. That's my take, and I think someone else online mentioned it too, about why she has these reactions to it. All right, so we'll have more to say. There's one more significant interaction between Dagny and Rearden that we'll get to towards the end of today. But I think we can move on to the rival philosophies. Ben, unless there's anything you want to add on the romantic side of it.
One question I have, and I don't have a good answer to this myself, and we don't have to talk about it now, but it's interesting to me that Rearden has this kind of optimism about the world and anxiety about his psyche, which is almost the reverse of Dagny. She has this anxiety about the world, but doesn't have the same kind of repression or neurosis or whatever it is that Rearden has about his psychology.
I think that's really true. I mean, Dagny is utterly guiltless, but kind of bitter and anxious. And Rearden is not bitter and not anxious, but does feel guilt.
And it's Dagny who's always speaking in terms of the world that she's waiting for, and then being concerned that this isn't her world. So it's like she's got the soul she wants, but she doesn't have a world to match it yet. Though that it turns out there's more to say about that. But maybe we should move on to the next section.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because so Greg has now said a lot about the bond that's forming between Dagny and Rearden, and what looks like the beginnings of a romance, perhaps. Surely part of this bond has to do with common viewpoints on their part. And I wanted to start by asking a few questions about what the viewpoint they have in common and how it contrasts with a number of other viewpoints from a number of other characters that are presented in this very chapter. So I'm going to start by reading a passage that I think encapsulates this bond of theirs, this kind of philosophic bond of theirs. And what I want people to be thinking about, and please write about this in the chat if you have thoughts, is whose views in the chapter does this passage end up repudiating? Whose views in the chapter does this passage contrast with? And there are several that we can talk about, and some of it has been discussed already online. But let me just read for you this passage. This is on page 168. And this is after Rearden has shown up in Colorado, and they're discussing the bridge and Rearden's new idea for how to make a better bridge out of Rearden metal, which Dagny hadn't thought possible. This is on page 168. And we get the internal perspective of Dagny here. She did not notice that they had sat down, that they were sitting on a pile of frozen lumber, that her legs were pressed to the tough planks and she could feel the cold through her thin stockings. They were bent together over a few scraps of paper, which could make it possible for thousands of tons of freight to cross a cut of empty space. His voice sounded sharp and clear while he explained thrusts, pulls, loads, wind pressures. The bridge was to be a single 1,200-foot truss span. He had devised a new type of truss. It had never been made before and could not be made except with members that had the strength and the lightness of Rearden metal, which is, of course, the very metal that he designed. And he explained to her earlier that he invented this kind of truss, but he invented Rearden metal so that he could have a kind of metal that such a truss could be built from. So I think that there's this passage is a kind of focal point in a certain way for the way in which it stands in contrast to a number of other viewpoints that have been expressed already earlier in the chapter, but even later as well. And does anybody have any thoughts as to which kind of viewpoint I'm talking about? So the focus here is just a few scraps of paper make it possible to lift this mass across this gorge. And Doran on the chat already has the first point that I had in mind, which is that, Ben Neely, the new contractor, has said muscles, that's all it takes to build anything in the world. That's on page 163 of the Standard Edition. And Dagny, listening to what he said, has, looks down at the bottom of the gorge and wonders if the cave dwellers could have built a bridge like this just with their muscles. And I think this represents her answer to that question. Not only could they not have done it, not only could many people have not have done it, she doesn't even seem to think she could have done it. Only Rearden in this one very specific circumstance, or someone like Rearden with this very specific idea, this very abstract achievement of the intellect is what makes it possible to lift this metal across this gorge. And so, when Neely expresses an idea like that it's only muscles that you need to make anything in the world, you understand why he thinks Wyatt is a show-off when Wyatt shows up and says, why does he think he's the only one who knows his business? Well, it turns out that there are only a few people who know what needs to be done to make this thing happen. And Greg's going to talk a little bit more later about the efforts that Dagny herself has to undertake and the kind of intellectual connections that she has to make in order to move this railroad forward. Who else in the chapter is this viewpoint repudiating. We talked about Neely, who thinks all that matters are muscles, that apparently the mind, Rearden's mind, Wyatt's mind, Dagny's mind aren't playing any special role here. He thinks that they're arrogant to think otherwise. Do we get any other viewpoints that are in contrast to this idea? Pooja says Dr. Stadler, and I think that's also true. And we actually asked a question in the Facebook group about the ways in which Stadler's view of life are similar to another major character, or not another major character, but another character who makes a major appearance even before Stadler does in the chapter. And I actually want to talk about the other character before I get to Stadler, because I think it builds us up to the point of Stadler, and that's the bum in the diner. So, Dagny has been in this on the way to what turns out to be a kind of trap where she's supposed to debate about the merits of Rearden metal, and gets out of the car. And William calls them the coffee shop guys online. And she gets out of the car, she walks down an alleyway, she goes into a diner. And we get this very interesting character, the bum, an old bum at the diner who says, "It's dust, lady, all of it, dust and blood." And we could have a separate conversation about whether this is the only appearance of this bum in the book. But he also says, "There isn't any human spirit. Man is just a low-grade animal without intellect, without soul, without virtues or moral values, an animal with only two capacities, to eat and to reproduce." Now, interestingly, this bum is fairly more intellectual sounding than someone like Neely. Neely just has this kind of gruff, "It's all we need is muscles." The bum gives a whole speech, and Dagny looks at him and thinks, "Looks like he used to be something maybe in a former life. How did he get to be in this kind of position?" So, I mean, one question we could think about here is, this slightly more elevated version of Neely's view that we're just a low-grade animal without intellect, without soul, without moral values or virtues. Is that a viewpoint that reminds people of anyone else we've heard, not maybe in this chapter, but elsewhere in the book? And maybe people in New York would like to comment on that a little bit.
Go ahead.
Something we talked about pretty recently.
Sounds like Pritchett was spouting at the party.
So we hear that it's,
Yeah.
Will saying it sounds like Pritchett, also maybe Lillian.
Yeah, both Brian and William online said just the same thing. And remember, Pritchett had said man is just a collection of chemicals with delusions of grandeur. And so you have the same viewpoint that's found all the way from, rarefied university on down to the bums on the street somehow have picked this up. Nevertheless, there's Rearden, and Rearden's intellect has delivered to us this kind of sublime achievement, this soaring structure across a chasm. Is the bum right about this? At the same time, is there anything that the bum and Rearden would actually agree about? Especially in light of the conversation that we just had about Rearden and Dagny. Are there any passages in the bum's little speech where he says something that Rearden would have to kind of sign up for, in spite of himself, perhaps?
Mohammed, is this what you wanted to talk about?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The bum is right, call him a bum, if about describing morality, because he talks about this because he says the industrialists they have no morality, and Dagny asks him, well, what is morality? And he responds, judgment to distinguish right and wrong, vision to see the truth, courage to act upon it, dedication to that which is good, integrity to stand by the good at any price. And that's something I can't see either Dagny nor Hank disagreeing with. It's just that they believe that the way to do that would be to do things like build bridges and design rails.
Okay, so we're seeing this come up on the chat too. So, Ben, you're saying, is there anything that the bum and Rearden would agree on? And the bum presents a view of morality that we don't know if Rearden would agree with it or not, but that does seem like Rearden and Dagny embody it.
Yeah, and that wasn't the first thing that I had in mind, though. I think there's something to it, and we're definitely going to talk more about it in a few minutes. But actually, Pooja online went to the passage that I had in mind more particularly, which is where the bum says, "There's no spirit involved in manufacturing or in sex, yet these are man's only concerns." So, I mean, we've just heard Rearden thinking to himself. Now, it actually happens a little bit later in the chapter, but we talked about Rearden thinking to himself about how sex is this low animal desire, and apparently he would have to get on board with the bum about this. He doesn't seem to agree with, or at least there's no reason to think that he would agree with the bum about no spirit being involved in manufacturing, but he does seem to agree with him on the sex point. And this is, I think, the first part of the book where we see these two questions paired together. What is the relationship between your view about something like industry and economics and your view on something like sex? Normally, we don't think of these as really, closely related to each other, but the bum thinks that there's a connection between the two of them. And this is not the first time, by the way, we've heard Rearden express this idea, which he seems to agree with the bum about. We saw him thinking the same kinds of thoughts at the end of the non-commercial chapter, where he thought he came to believe the doctrine that this desire was wholly physical, a desire not of consciousness but of matter. That was on page 158. So does Dagny agree with that view of sex? I don't think so. We talked about that earlier. And we talked about how there's a kind of contrast between Dagny and Rearden on this very issue. So they both disagree with the bum on certain things, but not both of them disagree about everything. Last point I want to talk about is Stadler, but I want to hear maybe somebody has something else they want to say about the bum before we move on. We are still going to talk about his views about morality separately.
We have a few hands on the bum here in New York.
Okay.
That sounds a little odd. Yeah, keep your hands off the bum. Who would want to chime in on this? Carry your hand. All right.
Give it a moment.
I think that in a certain sense, at least going into this chapter, Hank Rearden would agree also with the bum that morality and the spirit's not involved in business. Mm-hmm. And that's because thus far he's accepted the condemnations from his family that he's evil because he selfishly pursues his business interests and is so driven by it, and he's just accepted that banner that he is immoral and morality must be something else. But he's kind of on shifting sands in this chapter, and this might be jumping ahead a little bit, but when he has that conversation with his mother about whether Philip should get a job at the steel mill,
Yeah.
the first time Rearden uses moral language, he says it would be unjust to give Philip the job. And I think it's dawning on him that, wait a second, maybe morality and business kind of go together. He talks about desert and justice, and it would be unjust for Philip to get a job from him when he's not qualified to get one. So
And not only does he call it unjust, I think he says something to his mother like, "I don't know what it is that you call morality."
Yes.
And she says, "What is your mill? Some kind of a temple? A holy temple?" And he says, yes, like the thought is just dawning on him there. So we see Rearden starting to connect morality and his business life here in a way that he hasn't before. So I guess, Ben, you could say that's the way in which Rearden's, maybe in previous chapters at least, he seemed more like the bum on business. He said to Francisco, here is how I'm like, go ahead and call it immoral. And Francisco says, everything you said is true, except that you'd let anyone call it immoral. And maybe it's Francisco dawning on him, maybe it's just having taken some time, maybe it's how absurd what his mother says to him is from his point of view.
Also, in one of the earlier meetings with Dagny. He looks at her and tells her, "We're a couple of blackguards, aren't we?" And she says, "Why?"
Yeah.
And-
Well, she doesn't say why, but he just.
No, but she gets shocked or something.
Mhm. Yeah. So that's another place where we see Rearden having held a view more like the bums, though he's seeming like even there he was not. He didn't fully feel it because he said, "Well, whatever we are, it's we who move the world." But now he's starting to explicitly articulate the alternative to it. So also, I guess
So
why
maybe
we're
we should-
talking. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say we should maybe move on to Stadler, but it sounded like you wanted to say something transitional to that.
Well, just one thought before we move on to Stadler. This started with how the bum and Neely are alike, and I think there is a difference worth noting. We don't quite know the tone that Neely has when he says muscles, Miss Taggart, is all it takes to build anything. But it doesn't sound like he's down on that fact, right? It seems like he's a contractor. He likes using his muscles to build things. So I always took it as this isn't Neely's not bemoaning the fact that, from his point of view, muscles can build everything. It's what he thinks is involved here, and he's happy enough about it, and he has this view. It is a view that denies the role of intelligence or the mind in things, but Neely's view isn't, damn it, human beings suck, they don't have any mind or spirit, it's just muscles. His view is, man, muscles are awesome, look at all they can do. What the bum has is sort of a related view, but with a negative kind of tone to it. The bum has this idea that we've been told there's more to life than muscles and our animal instincts and so forth, but alas, that's BS. Don't believe all the stories they tell you about that. So the bum is someone who has a view, unlike Neely's, who wants something more than Neely, but is disillusioned about it, is how I would put it.
Okay. Well, maybe now we should move on to Stadler, who is, unlike the bum and unlike Neely, going to turn out to be a fairly regular character in the novel, and we learn a lot about his character in this scene. Now, we had posted a question on the group earlier about the way in which, asking how is Stadler's view of life like that of the bum. And we'd also asked whether there were any differences in their views. We got a lot of good commentary from people about similarities, not as much about differences. And so I want to quickly go through some of the similarities, but then be thinking about, while I'm doing this, thinking about what the differences still might be. I mean, after all, Stadler is not a bum, and that has some consequences. So Brian G. on the Facebook group had a pretty good summary of a number of the similarities in their views. Just like the bum thinks that man is a low-grade animal without intellect, at one point Stadler, page 191 in Standard Edition, says human beings are nothing but vicious animals. Just like the bum says, you go through life looking for beauty, for greatness. What do you find? A lot of trick machinery for making upholstered cars or inner spring mattresses. What's wrong with inner spring mattresses? Somebody says. Likewise, we have Stadler saying human beings are incapable of conceiving such a thing as abstract science. They can judge it only in terms of the latest gadget it has produced for them.
I haven't put my sound back on. It looked like Ben's back. Ben, back to you.
What's the last thing you heard me say? Latest gadget. Okay, so that was basically the last thing that I said. So those are some of the interesting similarities. Do we have thoughts on differences between the bum and Stadler? There definitely is a difference, and it's a slightly philosophical difference too, I would say. Here's one way of maybe thinking about it. Is Stadler somebody who thinks that human beings, just as such, are totally without intellect? mean, he emphasizes how they're like animals, I guess, but is his view that every single human being has no intellect? Could that possibly be his view?
We're getting shaking of heads here. Shaking of heads here in New York.
Okay. Somebody want to explain? I was hearing a little echo there, by the way.
Mohammed, do you want to talk about this?
Well, clearly he doesn't think all human beings don't have intellect. I don't think he would say that about himself or some of his brightest students.
Or about Dagny.
Right. But he does think that it's wasted if it's not directed towards things he sees as just abstract science that have nothing to do, so long as they have nothing to do with practical application of technology or anything that really has to do with dealing with people. So things like studying cosmic rays he would probably describe as beautiful, whereas the bum said there isn't any beauty. Stadler would say, no, look at this, it's in space, and it's far away, it has nothing to do with us, so it's beautiful.
Yeah, and even technology, which he disparages, part of what's wrong with technology from his perspective is you're dealing with people. So he has this idea that there is rationality. It's this rare and precious thing. He values it in Dagny. He values it in his students. He speaks with this real, genuine appreciation for them, but he thinks it's very rare, and he thinks it's people in general are driven by something else. And when you're dealing with people, as you inevitably are in technology, and dealing with any practical concerns, then I don't know. It's how would you put it, Ben?
Yeah, and remember why Dagny is here in the first place. She's here to talk about the State Science Institute's condemnation of Rearden metal. And Stadler doesn't want to rescind the decision for a variety of reasons, but which we might talk about. But when Dagny pushes him, he will say, yeah, this is a pretty amazing technological achievement as technological achievements go, as applied science goes. So he's acknowledging that someone like Rearden has an intellect, for sure. But yeah, there's kind of a difference in grade of intellect for him. And here's the passage I think that really sums it up. This is on page 189 of the Standard Edition. He says, it's only in the realm of pure science that truth is an absolute criterion. She keeps asking him, what's the truth about Rearden metal? Don't you care? When we deal with applied science, with technology, we deal with people. And we deal with people, considerations other than truth enter into the question. So like what Greg was saying there, if you're talking about the question, what's the truth of the value of this piece of technology? Well, technology is something that's used for a purpose. And it's only a good thing if you can evaluate as good the purpose of the technology. And Stadler seems to think that there isn't a way of doing that. There aren't any facts of the matter that can help us decide whether or not a purpose of a piece of technology is good or bad. All we have is what he calls the expediency of the moment. And where he and the bum seem to agree is that theoretical reason is an impossibility, at least for most people. That it's something they don't appreciate, that it's something they don't engage in. He'll make an exception and say, well, a few of us, when we're given proper funding by the state, are able to go after it, but that's about it. And Greg, I think you wanted to make a kind of comparative philosophy point here.
Well, I've written about this issue in Atlas Shrugged, in the essays on Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged. One of my chapters is on the role of the mind in man's life, what the novel has to say about that. And I talk about the different aspects of the mind's role. One is it being the productive faculty. And part of what I'm interested in there is, people have known since very early that it's by, being rational that human beings are able to make all the different things human beings make. I mean, the Greeks certainly knew this. And so I wanted to get at what's distinctive about what Ayn Rand has to say about that. And so I compare her view to Plato's view and Aristotle's view, which I think is represented in the novel by Stadler. And since we're a little behind time tonight and there's a lot we want to get to, I don't want to go into that further now, but those of you who've read the novel before, because there are a few spoilers in it, in that section, if you're interested in this kind of thing, I recommend looking up that section of that chapter. The chapter is called Atlas Shrugged on the Role of the Mind, and it's the first, I guess the second big section of the chapter, Reason is the Productive Faculty, that has this material. Ben, should we move on now to talking about the moral issues here?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the issue that Muhammad raised earlier.
This is the issue that Muhammad raised, and I think it is true that the Stadler and the bum are both saying that human beings are not. They lack reason in Stadler's view, or most of them do, and in the bum's view, they lack spirit. And interestingly, particularly if you look at the Greeks, reason and spirit aren't always seen as the same thing. But what the bum is especially focused on, and that's I think Muhammad was right to point out, is that there's something noble or good that he associates with spirit that he thinks people don't have. There's no kind of morality, says the bum, involved in sex or manufacturing. And Dagny says, well, then, what is morality anyway? And the bum says, judgment to distinguish right and wrong, vision to see the truth, courage to act upon it, dedication to that which is good, integrity to stand by the good at any price, but where do you find it? And so what is the answer? Where do you find it? Where could the bum find it if he looked?
In the middle,
Right in front of him.
Yeah, right in front of him. There's Dagny who's doing this, and in the next scene, right, I think we get so we have Dagny, and we'll talk in a moment or two about the ways in which Dagny exemplifies this. In the very next scene of the chapter, we cut to Rearden, and I think we get a really striking example of how Rearden exemplifies the very things that the bum is talking about in language. I think strikingly close to the bum's. So Ben, do you wanna fill us in on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth reviewing a little bit about what's happening in this section, but there's a pretty stark contrast between this agent of the State Science Institute and Rearden, and you can compare them along the exact same dimensions that have just come up in the bum's kind of definition of morality. Rearden keeps, they say they don't want him to bring it onto the market, Rearden metal. And he asks them, is it good? Is it good? And he doesn't want to answer. He won't say whether it's good or not, but they're afraid to see it come on the market for one thing, no matter what. Even when they later actually issue a statement, by the way, it's interesting that they don't really say anything. And this is the way that Eddie puts it. They said it. They didn't say it. It's not there. There's nothing that can really be refuted. They just say, well, maybe it will do this, and maybe it will do that. Maybe it won't. It's like Dagny's cotton that Greg has talked about before. It's just this kind of undefined, indeterminate wall that's going up against their kind of action. So they're indecisive. They don't actually want to commit to actually saying anything, to saying that anything's true. And by the way, Stadler's the same way, even though he, kind of privately acknowledges that Rearden metal is good, he says he doesn't want to say it publicly. He can't destroy the Institute now. And that's in spite of the fact that the motto of the Institute is to the fearless mind, to the inviolate truth. Compare that all to Rearden. What was the definition of morality according to the bum? Judgment to distinguish right and wrong, vision to see the truth, courage to act upon it, dedication to that which is good, integrity to stand by the good at any price. Well, he's got the vision to create the metal in the first place, to see it through to completion, not to mention the bridge. He's got the judgment to recognize it as good. At one point, the agent of the State Science Institute says, whose judgment are you using? And he says, my own. He's got the courage to bring it into reality in spite of the uncertainty, in spite of the fact that, there's these obstacles that are being put up against it now, including the State Science Institute and, public skepticism. And he's got, I think this is particularly striking, since the last thing the bum mentioned is integrity. He's got the integrity to not accept the government's offer to buy this from him, just so that it'll go off the market, because it's his. and because of everything he's put into it, and because he knows that it's good. And yet he's just a manufacturer. Is this what you would call manufacturing devoid of spirit and intellect and morality? Well, it seems to follow the bum's own definition of it.
When the guy from the State Science Institute, Dr. Potter, says, off record, just you and me personally, for my own curiosity, why are you doing this? He says, it's because Rearden metal is good.
Yeah. Which is what Potter, I'm sorry I was forgetting his name, was unwilling to say, and what Stadler was unwilling to say. And remember, Stadler has this view that the intellect, there are no matters of fact that you can appeal to with the intellect to decide whether or not certain purposes are good. Well, Rearden apparently disagrees with that. He's staking his judgment on his observation of matters of fact about this metal.
It's not clear to me that Stadler thinks you can't, by the intellect, ever judge whether things are good. But if you could, it wouldn't matter. Because even if the intellect, there's a kind of view in philosophy where the intellect can't judge ends. I don't think that we know that Stadler holds that view. Maybe the intellect could judge ends, but it wouldn't matter if it could, because other people would be incapable of seeing them. And so what are you going to do when you have to deal with people? The only thing you can do is deal by the expediency of the moment, where there's no intellectual way to determine even what means an end, or what means are good to what ends, because everything's random. I mean, Stadler, it's not a fact-value dichotomy, I think, for Stadler, because Stadler doesn't even think you can predict facts, like what's going to happen to the economy in 6 months. It's as though he views people as acting at random, and so they're incomprehensible and unjudgeable, except for the fact that this fact about them is bad, but there's nothing you can do about it. Ben, go ahead, Ben.
I think it's notable that as a consequence of this view about people, it's worth underscoring what he thinks should be done as a result of that. He thinks that basically people need to be forced to do what he thinks they should live, the way they should live. He thinks he could teach them how to live. And the concrete example of this, of course, is that they should be forced to pay for him to work at the State Science Institute. And that goes hand in hand with a certain view of human nature, people as sort of automatons, though apparently he's accepting himself from that kind of claim. And that's
he's a bit like the character of Cameron in The Fountainhead. He's someone who thinks he knows better than other people how other people can lead their life and what would be good, but he can't convince them of it. He knows no way to do it, and he's given up on that. But in particular, the way he's given up here is he's resorted to getting Dr. Ferris to run interference for him and force those greedy ruffians to support his research. So let me shift over to the way in which we see Dagny exhibiting these traits, and just think about what's going on in Dagny's career in this chapter. So first, take a look at what's involved in the initial building of the line, back when it's still the Rio Norte line. Notice she's taking everything on herself. She's sometimes accepts that nobody else could see the value of Rearden metal. Sometimes she tries to convince people, the guy, Mr. Moen, who's manufacturing the signals, and all these other people. But whatever it is, she's just kind of powering through it. She's getting everything done by herself. She's picking up all the slack. And it's interesting, we might think about it, I don't think we have time to take much time on it here, that she's even using bribes and threats to get people to do it, which is striking. It's like arguments, cajoling people, trying to get them to do what she wants them to do. It's like if you've ever worked on a school project where you're assigned a group, and nobody else cares or knows how to do it, and you feel like you're the only one who's interested. Or sometimes in an organization, you'll be working on a team, and it'll feel like nobody else on the team is really focused on what it actually takes to do this. And you feel, I think Ben had this experience, he's smiling, where you feel like it's just you alone and you have to power through everything. That's the kind of situation in which Dagny is. We see this really all over the place. And, in the case of Mr. Moen, you might wonder, is his attitude so unreasonable? Right? He's this guy, he's trying to build these signals, he needs new equipment, his people don't know how to build the switches, and, but he's not somebody who's saying, look, this is a big risk, I don't want to do it, get someone else. He's, I've done the calculations, I know what the issues are, and he's someone who's rather just vague about it. He doesn't even want to commit one way or the other. He's someone who thinks, you can just, he resents, it seems, the necessity of making a decision about whether to use this metal. It's as though things ought to be kind of simple and easy, and nobody should bring up anything new and challenge him to take the stand on it. And that's also where so many of the people Dagny's dealing with seem to be. And she just sort of powers through that by convincing them where she can, bribing, intimidating, the force of personality where she can't. And so now we get to the point where she decides to form the John Galt line. She goes to Jim, and now the pressure, the public opinion against Rearden Metal has gotten too great. They can't just keep on doing it. Everybody's not wanting to deal with Rearden Metal. Its stock is crashing because of the State Science Institute thing. And she comes to Jim and she says, here's what we're going to do. She gives him an ultimatum. And the ultimatum is she's going to form her own company. They're going to turn over the Rio Norte line to her. She's going to build it on her own, acting as her own contractor. She won't need Neely anymore, who wasn't any use anyway, and he's just quit. She'll get her own financing to finish it. And she'll be able to finish it. But what's striking about this is that this move is all downside. All the risk is hers. She has to raise the money herself against her $7 million that she's able to get for her stock in Taggart Transcontinental, which is presumably her whole fortune. So she's risking her fortune. If it doesn't succeed, she's going to not be able to come back to her job at Taggart Transcontinental, which is what her whole life has been, right? This has been the centerpiece of her life. Now, granted, she thinks if this doesn't succeed, Taggart Transcontinental and the world is going to hell in a handbasket anyway, but nevertheless, she won't be able to come back there. And on the other hand, if she succeeds, she can't sell it back to them for a windfall profit. She has to sell it back to them at cost. So she has to work harder. She has to take on more risk. But there's no upside for her other than the upside she would have already had of completing the thing for Taggart Transcontinental. Carrie Ann?
I was going to say, the one thing that she does seem to get, this is page 189 of the mass market edition, when finally Jim says, okay, whatever you want within these parameters, and he says, well, it's your line, and she goes, you bet it is.
Right.
So she asserts ownership. It's hers, just like Rearden had earlier in the chapter said, I'm not selling it to you because it's mine.
Yeah.
And she gets to say that finally, and this is empowering to her.
So she gets ownership. She gets that she doesn't have to go and beg Jim's board for permissions, and that's what she says she gets out of it. But she doesn't get any actual profit out of it.
Right. But
so
this is also where she starts acting like Nat Taggart.
Yeah.
This odd primitive quality in her face, and she says, if he didn't do it and it's just legend, I'm going to complete it if anybody gets in my way.
Right. So this is two, and we talked about this Nat Taggart scene before. We get two. This is the rumor that Nat Taggart killed a state legislature who denied him a permission that he shouldn't have had to get. Right? And we get two instances of this, actually, in this chapter. Because when Mr. Potter comes from the State Science Institute to talk to Rearden, he threatens a few different things. He threatens, we might issue a statement. And then he says, there are all kinds of, we're a government organization, Mr. Rearden, and there are all kinds of things. Who knows what might come before the legislature that might be hanging by a hair, and you don't know what influence is going to push it. And everybody knows that the Equalization of Opportunity bill is something that's been talked about. So he's threatening that he'll be the deciding factor that the Equalization of Opportunity bill will be passed. And he says, sure you understand me, Mr. Rearden? And Rearden responds, I don't. If I did, I would have to kill you. So Rearden says, if you threaten to destroy my business, I'll kill you. And Dagny then says, Jim, your part of this bargain is that you can keep all the regulators and all the people who I need to get special permissions from off my back, meaning that I'll get the permissions, but I'm not going to have to bribe them and deal with their petty graft and etc. If there's any kind of threats like that, I don't know if Nat Taggart did it, but I will. So I think this scene is important, that we can't take the earlier scene about Nat Taggart doing this as saying, well, it's just a rumor. If Dagny thought there was any truth to it, she'd say, she'd think less of Nat Taggart. She said, if I'm put in Nat Taggart's situation, I would do it, because what was happening in that situation is somebody was threatening him to destroy something that he rightly viewed as extremely important. Now, we can talk more about the morality of that and whether that's right, but it is Dagny's view. And it does seem to be Rearden's view. Not that he should be able to override the legislature just by force of will or something, but if somebody's schemingly, dishonestly extorting him in a situation where that person somehow has got the authority of state, but with no moral legitimacy, Rearden thinks that's the right thing to do. Yeah, some kind of a view of that it's in self-preservation. So Dagny is taking on a lot more effort here. It's harder for her. It's riskier for her, right? And she doesn't get any extra upside, and that's something that's really significant. And I think it's significant to the title of The Exploiter and the Exploited. Who's being exploited here? You might think Dagny. You might think Rearden, especially in light of the last scene, which we'll come to in due course. So just what else does Dagny do to get the John Galt line started? Well, she can't get any money for it from normal channels through big banks and things, for the same reason that Taggart Transcontinental can't finance it, that there's all this rage of public opinion against Rearden Metal, and no big company will touch it. She goes to Francisco and tries to get it in a really touching scene where we learn something interesting about Francisco. My love, I can't, he says, right? And that maybe we can come back to at the end if people want to talk about it. But it's a touching scene between Rearden and Francisco. Between Dagny and Francisco. And then she's able to get the money from Ben says from Rearden she borrowed it. What the details of it is, she's able to get enough money to go ahead by selling bonds to Wyatt, to all these other people in Colorado who need the line, and who she didn't think could afford it, but they know that they need this line, and so they're going to put their money where their needs are, I guess, or they're not going to count on someone else to do it for them. And then when Dagny tells that to Rearden, Rearden then matches. He gives the largest donation, so he has the largest financial stake in it, other than Dagny, and I think she had enough to go ahead even without Rearden, but Rearden puts in a lot of money, and that's where we are. Ben, do you want to go? Do you want to talk about the Francisco issue now, or do you want to go ahead to the other characters you want to talk about?
I think in the interest of time, actually, we should skip that, and we should skip the Philip and Ward scene. You should do the last scene, and then if we have time, we can come back to Philip and Mr. Ward, if that makes sense. Okay.
I mean, we did talk a little bit about Mr. Philip and Philip, and I think the most significant phenomenon to do with it earlier when Carrie Ann brought up the scene. So let's jump ahead then, and this is the other, I think, really significant issue of exploitation in the chapter. The Equalization of Opportunity bill is passed. So just as kind of understanding where we are in the plot, what is this kind of closing the loop on? Where did we first hear of this possibility of this bill, and now that's chickens coming home to roost? Thoughts? So Robert says at the party, where before going to the party, Rearden's reading the editorial and thinking about it, and everybody at the party are thinking about
At
it.
the top of the skyscraper.
Yeah, the ballroom at the top of the skyscraper, right? So
Paul Lockton once.
when they go up to the top of the skyscraper, this is the beginning of chapter 3, right? Jim Taggart is there talking to Orrin Boyle, Wesley Mouch, and Paul Larkin, right? And the situation there is that Orrin Boyle is complaining about steel and how is it that one person can be frivolously experimenting with a new alloy. He's the only guy who has access to ore, and it's a monopoly situation and so forth. And Taggart says, in effect, implies that he could solve the situation. There are people in the legislature who could be approached about it. You have to know how to talk to them and so forth. He could do it, but he wants something in return. Namely, he wants the anti-dog-eat-dog bill, which Orrin Boyle helped him to pass. So now, and then we wondered what's Wesley Mouch, who was Rearden's Washington man, and Paul Larkin doing at this table. And now we know, right? Boyle did what he could for Jim Taggart. He said, now, Jimmy, it's your turn to pay up, a couple of chapters ago. Now this equalization of opportunity bill has passed, a bill which is going to target Rearden. He's now not going to be able to own his ore mines and the copper mine that he's considering buying and the limestone thing that he owns and his steel mill. He's not going to be able to have a vertically integrated business. He's going to have to break it up, which is going to destroy the advantage he had that let him be able to be a reliable steel producer where someone like Orrin Boyle wasn't. And so Jim talked to whoever it was to make that happen. And Wesley Mouch kind of stood down and didn't defend Rearden. And we don't know what Larkin's role is, but we'll see about that soon. Ben, yeah.
That was what I was going to say. Yeah, I was going to say we can infer what Mouch's role is here, but we don't yet know about Larkin. That may be coming soon. We certainly hear that Mouch is not available for commentary on the fact that this bill has been passed, even though he's the one who's supposed to have been fighting against it and making sure that it didn't get brought to the floor of the legislature. And if you remember, one of the things that Taggart had been saying back in the chapter on the top of the skyscraper was, we were hoping that Mouch is very good at not saying anything, and we're hoping he's not going to say anything this time around too. So, but
and
I just
then
wanted to mention the thing about Larkin.
And then we see that Mouch resigns from Rearden's employ and gets this job as deputy director of the Bureau of Economic Planning. So he gets some job in government, maybe as maybe we only hear about that in the next chapter. I forget. But anyway, so that's a slight spoiler. But he quits. Okay, so Rearden hears about this. He doesn't hear about it from Mouch, as he should. He's not even told by Mouch that the thing has come to a vote, but rather his secretary, Gwen Ives, who's been introduced a little earlier in the scene. Rearden's whole day is narrated to us. Earlier in the day, he decides he's going to take the option on this copper property. That's important, by the way. He needs copper to make Rearden metal. Rearden finds that there's not a reliable copper supply, and so he decides he has to go in the copper mining business, as he has to be in the ore mining business and the limestone business to supply all the things he needs to make his product. So he tells his secretary, who is someone who would never show any emotion, she'd consider it like a dereliction of duty to show any emotion in the workplace, to go tell the guy he's going to take the option on the copper mine. And then he has several different interviews, including with his character, Mr. Moen, who's an interesting and I think sympathetic character. And Mr. Ward. Sorry, Mr. Moen is the cowardly switchmaker. Thank you, guys. With Mr. Ward. And then Gwen Ives rushes in the middle of this meeting saying, oh my God, the legislature's passed it. They've passed this anti-dog-eat-dog rule. She's, distraught. Her composure's broken. That's why it was set up earlier, that she's somebody who would never let emotions show at work to show what a big deal this is to her, right? And what is his response? Well, he rises, right, immediately, kind of in shock. And then he kind of, and Mr. Ward screams, "Oh no," and so forth. And Rearden kind of sits himself back down, and he says, "What is it that those, bastards accuse us of, among other things? It's our slogan, business as usual." Well, business as usual, Mr. Ward. And Mr. Ward's come there to see if there's any way Rearden can get some extra steel to him. He'll pay any price. He just doesn't want to have to close down his business, waiting for. And Rearden goes ahead, even though it's making more work for him, because he was about to do it, and he wants to, I think, reaffirm that this isn't going to destroy me. Right? He calls up his foreman. He says, "Oh, forget about that. But business as usual. Can we get this much extra steel for Mr. Ward?" And he does it. And he goes about the rest of his appointments for the day courteously, as though nothing's wrong. Then he goes out and he sees Gwen, crying basically, and he kind of consoles her and acts as though nothing is wrong. And, "Oh, go home. I'm going to go home soon anyway, Gwen," and she does. Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, just before you go to the next part, it's worth pointing out, I'll just, the one thing that I wanted to say about the Mr. Ward Philip comparison that's applicable here is, notice how it would have been probably pretty easy for Rearden to give a job to his brother, all things considered, but pretty hard comparatively to find a few extra tons of steel given everything else he was working on. And yet, even in spite of the passage of the Equalization of Opportunity Bill, he still gets that extra steel for Ward and doesn't give the job to Philip.
The issue is, the thing with Ward is a kind of honest thing he can do. And he can do it once and do it. To give the job to Philip, he would have to pervert the nature of his mind. You have to have a fake job in his mind, because Philip can't do any work. But I think it's so I don't know how you would describe which is easier and which is harder, but in any case, it is a significant difficulty to do this. And he does it. So now eventually he's at home alone now. Or not at home, at work alone. He's dismissed Gwen, and he has a real crisis of motivation. And he thinks, Mr. Ward and Gwen could look to me. Who could I look to? Is there anyone I know who I'd like to have here with me now? And who does he think? Francisco d'Anconia, the thought occurs to him, and he thinks, well, that's what you get when you indulge in weakness. You have these ridiculous thoughts. You want some playboy you met at a party once. Interesting, too, how the kind of background morality the novel is relying on, that Stadler, can dismiss. He's become some sort of a depraved playboy. How negative a valence this word has to all these characters. But anyway, Rearden has the thought that he wants Francisco, which is striking, but then he dismisses it as ridiculous. And then he thinks, why should he go on? And it's striking what this bill means, right? Why he hadn't even been consulted about it. Nobody cared about it. It just happened, and Miss Ives only learns about it because somebody in the office hears it on the radio and tells her. No one even needed to consult him about it. And it's like slashing away at his body. He has to go on as a cripple, right? Rearden Steel is his life. And Rearden Steel works the way it does. What it is, because he's built it. He minds all the things. He's integrated it so that he could do this. And now he's going to have to go on as a cripple. He sees it as slashing away at his life. And why has he done all these? Why should he ever do anything again if this is what it's going to amount to? And he thinks back as to why he should do things. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I was going to say one sentence that started, I think, right before the party scene from last chapter. He stood at the window trying not to think. Mm-hmm. Ben had brought that up last time. And it's the same thing here, but now he's looking at, after all of this, filtering all this, he's thinking Rearden ore, Rearden coal, Rearden steel, Rearden metal. What's the use? Why had he done it?
Yeah. Now, he put the thoughts aside to get on with his day, but now he's going to take the time at the end of his day to think about it. And he thinks, I'd been putting it off. Now I have to deal with the thinking. But there's no thinking to do because there's nothing he can do, he thinks. And then in that context where there's no thinking he can do because there's no action he can take, that's when he starts to think, well, what's the point? Thinking is for acting, and my hands are tied here. my limbs are going to be slashed off and I'm going to have to hobble on as a cripple. That is, my business is going to be slashed to bits and I'm going to have to hobble on with it. And there's no action I can take. Yeah, Ben.
It's also important to connect this back to the scene with Stadler, because remember now that this is basically the consequence of Stadler's decision, though Stadler wouldn't acknowledge it, because of the fact that the State Science Institute has, condemned his medal. Well, not so much because of that, but because he's refused their offer. There was a bill pending in the legislature that the agent of the State Science Institute warned him they could do something about. And so because Stadler was unwilling to change the policy of the Institute, the bill is basically passed. And we see the consequence of his view that people are these automatons who need to be forced to do the things he wants them to do. And we see the consequence here, at least on one topic, is that Rearden's intellect is hobbled. He's not able to think about what to do with his business or, Rearden life anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that he can't think about anything. And I think that's the next thing you want to talk about.
Well, maybe, but yeah, it's Stadler. Not only is it the particular issue of did he change the policy of the Institute, but the whole State Science Institute exists because of Stadler, right? Some obscure scientists got a bill and they wasn't going to pass, but then Stadler sold it to the world. One of his students damned him for it, one of the people who was most important to him, these three students. And at the beginning he thought maybe that student was right? But now he thinks not, because he's realized that people are vicious and irrational and they don't think. And now Rearden, who does think, is not able to think about, there's nothing he can do because there's no action he can take, and so there's no thinking possible about how to deal with this bill. He just has to accept that he's been sacrificed. And that also is part of what Stadler thinks, right? What's going to be sacrificed? Something has to be sacrificed when you deal with people, as a rule, unjustly. Is it going to be the last center of science on Earth or an excellent piece of smelting? And so Stadler and Dan Conway are alike here, too. They think that when you deal with people, sacrifices are necessary. And Conway's willing to let himself be sacrificed. Stadler is willing to sacrifice Rearden. And so in part as a result of Stadler's decisions and others, we get this, Rearden's in this situation. And he's realizing there's nothing for him to do. His first priority when he hears about it is coping and dealing and not letting it unravel with him. So he puts the thoughts off till later. And then at the end of the day, after everybody goes home, now it's time to think it through. But there's nothing to do because there's nothing you can do about it. Someone's come and chopped off his legs, it's like, and now he's got to live with that, he thinks. And so that's where he is. And he thinks, why should he ever do anything again in that case? And why had he done what he did do? And he thinks back to why he had done what he did, the day when he was when he was in the mines, and the day when he did this, and the day when that, and he thinks back about why he did what he did, and the day when he thought that a bridge could be made, metal could be made that would carry all of this weight and do all these things that couldn't be done before, if you combined a truss with an arch. And then he stops, because he hadn't thought of combining a truss with an arch that day. And now he has a new thought about what's possible and how to do it. And suddenly he jumps up, right? He's standing, he's grabbing stray pieces of paper, he's furiously scribbling on someone's letters on this. He's all in on this new thought. And he calls up, it's said it's after midnight, right? He's an hour doing this, and he picks up a long-distance telephone and is calling a car on a siding in Colorado. That's where Dagny is, right? And she answers the phone. He's woken her up at 1 a.m, or maybe she's still up, and he calls her. And does anyone have this? One of you get this scene up? Or Ben, do you have it up? He calls her. He calls her, and yeah. So read the scene out. Or actually,
okay,
well, all right, or Ben's reading it now. Okay, go ahead, Ben.
Dagny, that bridge of ours, throw in the ash can all the drawings I sent you because what? Oh, that? To hell with that. Never mind the looters and their laws. Forget it, Dagny. What do we care? And he goes on to explain the new idea for the bridge. And you see, it's a matter of combining a truss with an arch. If we take diagonal bracing and what? I can't hear you. Have you caught a cold? What are you thanking me for as yet? Wait till I explain it to you. There's something
Right.
happening in those ellipses.
Yeah,
Right.
that's significant. So he calls her up. He's furiously excited. He's telling her this idea. Forget about that, right? She's bringing up, Hank, the equalization of opportunity. She's saying something about that, and he's waving it aside. What do we care about them and their? What do we care that they've done what he just said was like cutting his limbs off? And it made him think, why should I ever do anything again? So first thought, what does that tell us about the answer to why should he ever do anything again? What is it that motivates Rearden? Yeah, Mohammed.
Because he can come up with new things that inspire him, that seem very ingenious and create technical problems that he likes to solve.
Yeah.
He's a creator.
So when Rearden sees a new possibility and a way to realize it, when Rearden sees a way forward, something he can create, that's all that matters to him, and everything else goes out the window. And he's seen that now on a scale bigger than he thought had seen before, and so he's really enthusiastic, and that's what moves him. And that's what we are now seeing moved him all along. And when he sees there is some action he could take, it's not to deal with the equalization of opportunity bill, but it's to deal with something that's more important, making this bridge to him. That's where all his energy goes. And then he calls Dagny, and she wants to bring up that, and he says, forget about that. That doesn't matter. I've got this idea for this bridge. Well, I can't hear you. Do you have a cold? So what's happening there? Why can't he hear her? Does she have a cold?
Is she crying?
Yeah, she's crying. Judy says she's crying because she's so happy. She's crying, whether it's happiness or Rand had kind of interesting views about.
Or she was so distraught
tears of
before.
happiness. She was so distraught before, and she's so overwhelmed by that Rearden's, she's getting from Rearden. I think we have a kind of repeat of the Rearden-Gwen Ives scene now, with Dagny in Gwen Ives' role, which also says, there are all these people who could look to Rearden, and Dagny's one of them, which is, I think, a part of Dagny's relationship. Also, maybe Henry says it's a release of the fear she was holding in. She's probably been thinking, what is this going to do to Rearden? Remember how she was always worried about, would the world break Francisco, the last man she loved, or anyway, wanted in the way she wants Rearden, which she maybe hasn't quite admitted to herself. And if anything's going to break Rearden, this is. And Rearden calls her, and it's not like, well, I've got a way to deal with it. He's ecstatic about, who cares about that? This is bridge. If you trust me, trust with an arch. That's all that matters. And I think that's important for, understanding both of their characters. And with
Greg,
that,
if
I
I
think,
could
yeah, go ahead, Ben.
make one more quick comment on this, since a lot of what's been discussed in this chapter kind of philosophically is this question about is man just an animal? Is man just a bunch of muscles, or does he have a mind? And we've seen Rearden already as a kind of counterpoint to that view coming from Neely and from the Bum, just insofar as it's been his creation of the intellect that's been responsible for the progress in the line so far. We get, I think, another onion skin peeled away on that same topic, because now, not only is he not an animal, not only does he have an intellect, but he has this self-starting intellect that is able, and he'd reflected on this in previous chapters,
Good
to
point.
be the spark of its own, to be its own motive power, even in these terrible circumstances. And that, nothing could, that's a pretty stark contrast to something like, Stadler's view that people are just automatons that can be pushed around. I mean,
Yeah,
they
that's a really
can clearly
good
be
point.
stopped from thinking about certain things, but not everything in this case.
That's a really good point. And I think these themes about what is a human being are themes that are spanning now several chapters. We've seen them. What's the relation between thought and action and emotion? What is a human being in chapter 6? Now in chapter 7, I think we're going to see a lot more of it in chapter 8, and in a different way in the next part of the novel. But there's a climactic scene to do with it in chapter 8. If we want to, and I think, that is a really important part too. It's not just that Rearden's active and thoughtful and creates things, and that there's spirit involved in that creation. But there's also spirit and mind in something about Rearden's motivation, not just the clever ideas he comes up with, is significant to the role of his mind or spirit here, and is inspiring to Dagny, and is what keeps him going in the face of great opposition. And if we want to just go back to the title point, the exploiters and the exploited, there are scenes in the chapter where other people, kind of people who are more traditionally thought to be exploited, are mentioned as possible victims of exploitation. But I think what the chapter is meant to make us think is that the real exploited people here are Dagny and Rearden, and others like Wyatt too, to some extent. And what we're seeing is how these people deal with their exploitation. And for Dagny, both of them are always kind of taking on more work for themselves, allowing things to be worse or harder for themselves. And Dagny with a kind of bitterness or worry, and Rearden with a kind of, all the problems seem unreal to him, and it's unreal to him that they could continue to be problems as he sees a way forward or sees some action he could take. When there's some action Rearden sees he can take on anything that's important to him, nothing else matters. And I think, Ben, any last thoughts?
No, that wraps it up quite well, I think.
Okay, I've noticed, at least in this last section, that my audio's been peaking a little bit. I hope it wasn't doing that all night. That would mean that there'd be little clip sounds we'll have to hear. Did anybody on the online
I didn't notice any.
Okay. Well, you would have heard it if it was there. My sound would have sounded bad. So, good. Then it seems like we've been a relatively technical problem-free night. We just lost Ben for a few seconds at one point, but otherwise we were good. So thanks, everyone. We'll have new questions up in a couple of days, and we'll see you guys all next week.
Thank you.